There is a person I think about sometimes, a person I lost years ago in the sense that we are no longer in contact. We have not spoken in a very long time, and we have moved in entirely different directions through our lives. And yet, every now and then, something will catch me off guard. A song, a smell, a line of dialogue in a film. And the feeling that arrives is not the quiet, settled ache of old memory. It is immediate. It is present tense. It is, they are right here. I could just reach out. And that feeling used to confuse me. It used to feel like maybe I had failed at healing properly, like something in me was broken. And it took me a long time to understand that this is not a grief problem or a healing problem or even a relationship problem. It is a time problem. And it is one of the things that addiction does that almost nobody talks about directly. Today, I want to talk about what I call temporal fracture, the way addiction can cause certain parts of you to stop moving through time entirely, while the rest of the world just keeps going. If you are new here, my name is Zila Ferraco. I am a witch, I have a PhD in medical microbiology, and I am a recovering drug addict. My channel lives at the intersection of all those things: witchcraft and dark goddess work, psychology and the science of the mind, and the particular kind of understanding that comes from having lived through something rather than just studied it. Most of the time, those threads run alongside each other. This video is one of the places where they converge completely, because what I'm about to talk about is something I understood first through my own recovery, and then through years of working with clients and through my witchcraft practice. All three lenses have brought me to exactly the same place. If that intersection is something you want to explore, subscribe, hit that notification bell. This is the kind of content I make regularly. While my frame of reference is addiction and recovery, what I am describing, time freezing, grief that cannot be completed, people who become central to your survival, these things are not exclusive to addicts. If you grew up with chronic instability, or if you've lost people before you had the safety to actually fully mourn them, if you've ever felt like everyone else is living in a different time than you, this reaches further than it might seem. Whether you have lived this yourself, or whether you love someone who has, or whether you're simply trying to understand something about addiction or the sense of living outside of time that nobody has ever quite explained to you clearly, this video is for you. When we talk about addiction publicly, we tend to talk about it in terms of behavior. The using, the lying, the chaos, the rock bottom, the recovery arc. We talk about what addicts do, we talk about damage and destruction and the wreckage left behind, but what we talk about far less is what happens internally within the addict to the structure of time. Here is what I mean. Most people experience time as something roughly continuous. Events happen, they are metabolized, they become memory, and they recede. You grieve something and it moves from the foreground into the background. You lose a relationship and eventually the sharp edge softens. The past becomes the past, life goes on. Addiction, however, interrupts that process, not because addicts are incapable of feeling. In my experience, addicts are often the most deeply feeling people, clairsentient, empathic, porous to the emotional world in ways that are genuinely overwhelming, which is frequently why they had to resort to using drugs in the first place. Time interrupts because addiction, especially when it is rooted in trauma or survival, keeps the nervous system in a state where events cannot fully land, which means they cannot be processed in real time because there is no real safety in which to process them. So instead, they remain suspended, present tense, unresolved, preserved almost exactly as they were. Meanwhile, the body ages, the calendar moves, the world changes around you, but internally, certain things remain exactly as they were at the moment they happened. That is what I call temporal fracture. It is being unable to fully leave the past. There is a reason the metaphor that resonates most with me for this territory is the Lost Boys from Neverland. Now, Peter Pan syndrome has entered the popular cultural vocabulary, but it usually means something shallow. It's referring to the man-child who refuses to grow up, who avoids responsibility, who will never commit. It is talking about immaturity as some kind of character flaw, and that is not what I'm talking about here. The Lost Boys are something different. They're not necessarily refusing adulthood, rather they are stranded outside of it. They are children without parents or family, without structure, without continuity, living in a place where ordinary time does not apply. There is loyalty in their world. There is intensity. There is an internal logic that makes complete sense within Neverland, but they are suspended in time. Nobody grows, nobody fully arrives anywhere. Addiction culture, and I say this with the authority of someone who has lived inside of it for years, can function exactly like that. You gather around wounds. You regulate each other in the absence of genuine safety. Intensity gets mistaken for intimacy. Chaos gets mistaken for freedom, and the whole ecosystem functions on the shared, usually unspoken understanding that nobody is going to be required to fully arrive in adulthood, because adulthood would require confronting what is underneath. And for some of us, there's something even darker underneath that. We never expected to make it to adulthood at all. Dying young becomes the norm in those circles. It becomes, in some unspoken way, the plan. While everyone around you is living like they will not see 30, longevity stops feeling like something you are moving toward. And when one person tries to leave Neverland, it threatens everyone else. Because if one lost boy actually grows up, it forces the rest to acknowledge that time has, in fact, been passing. Addiction communities can unconsciously pull people back toward relapse, toward chaos, and toward dependence, and it is important to understand this with compassion, because this is not necessarily out of malice. It tends to be rooted in fears of abandonment and the terror of existential dread. Staying lost together is still being somewhere together. One of the strangest and most painful things that temporal fracture produces is what I can only call imprinting. During the years I was using, especially in my teens, the years I was truly in survival mode, certain people became not just important to me, but they were fully load-bearing in my life. They were psychologically foundational. They were people who, during times of collapse, represented safety or belonging, or the closest thing I had to a sense of home or family. Because when you grow up without a stable family structure, when your nervous system is in constant emergency, people who offer you even temporary regulation become attached to something very, very deep. They do not just become friends or lovers. They are anchors. They become embedded in your sense of what is real, what is safe, your sense of who you are. And so, while they often continued moving through linear time, especially if they're not addicts themselves, they go ahead to have children or start families and building lives, I remained in some part of myself still oriented toward the version of us that existed during that suspended era. I was still in Neverland. Years would pass. I would be fully present in my external life, seemingly functioning, building, and achieving. And yet, certain people remained vivid and near in my interior world in a way that made no logical sense given how little contact we'd had over the years. The painful realization that comes in recovery, and it does not arrive gently, is that people who live most vividly inside of you may not have thought about you in years. And it doesn't mean that you were meaningless to them. It's simply that you were carrying a completely different emotional reality than they were. You might have been a passing season in their life, a pleasant chapter, while to you, they were everything. A friendship that meant family when you had none. A lover that meant belonging when you had never belonged anywhere. An intense, intimate, crazy summer that interrupted your plan to kill yourself, while to them, it simply was a pleasant summer. That is the sharpest edge of asymmetric memory. The same weeks, the same conversations, the same shared space. One person walking away with a fond memory, the other one walking away with their life. You were carrying survival. You were carrying the weight of what that period actually meant, and they were just living their lives. That asymmetry and the grief that comes with it is one of the things I have never heard explained clearly in any conversation about addiction recovery, and it is devastating to live in this way. This is how imprinting causes temporal fracture. And I want to get specific here. I'm going to tell you a story from my own life because I think talking from the abstract only gets us so far. In my final year of high school, I was homeless and I was using and I was cutting myself. I had no functional family structure. I had absolutely no stable place to land, and I had a reasonable chance of not finishing school at all. Someone stepped in and put a roof over my head, gave me a place to be. They became a presence that was, without either of us fully understanding it at the time, stabilizing. Someone who, without knowing it, helped me stop using for a period and helped me to stay present enough to actually finish school. And finishing school led directly to university, which led to a PhD. And the PhD led to everything that came after. What emerged for me from a few short months with him changed the entire trajectory of my life. From my perspective, that person did not just do me a favor. They were the fulcrum point of my entire timeline. They were the reason the story went the way it did rather than the way it could have. From his perspective, he spent a wonderful, intense few months with his first real love. He was young, living his own chaotic life, and he was certainly not consciously saving anyone. He was just there. So we have the same months, but completely different cosmologies. And that is what I mean by asymmetric memory and imprinting. That was a pivotal point in my entire existence, and it was for him a chapter in a larger story that has kept on moving. What imprinting produces is not just confusion, though there is plenty of that. It is a deep pain, because when your experience of reality is so drastically different from the other person's, when there's that asymmetry, when what was enormous to you was unremarkable to them, it feeds something that is often already an open wound. The wound of not belonging anywhere, the wound of not having a family, the wound of abandonment, which does not require anyone to have left intentionally. Sometimes life just goes on, and for someone who was never given a stable foundation to return to, that ordinary movement of time can register as profound loss. And here is where imprinting connects directly to temporal fracture, because these people, the ones who were asymmetrically important to you, can get swept up in your temporal tornado. You might run into someone from that era at a grocery store, maybe a former lover, a friend maybe from yours that you were using, someone who was at one point an anchor for you. And you make plans to catch up, go for dinner, and then before you know it, you're in the middle of another emotionally intense chapter with them, as though no time has passed at all, because for the part of you that was frozen at the juncture, no time has actually passed. That chapter was never closed. Now you are just simply continuing it. And this is one of the most dangerous and least discussed aspects of temporal fracture. It means you can pick up with lovers or friendships with a speed and an intimacy that makes no logical sense given how much time has actually elapsed. The passage of time was never registered, and boundaries that you may have worked hard to establish in your present life blur almost immediately. Often, emotional intensity escalates fast, and the unmanageability that characterized the original era together begins to reassert itself because you have stepped back into a time where unmanageability was the norm. The chaos of temporal fracturing perpetuates itself. It is the mechanics of a nervous system that never received the signal that it was safe to move forward. If this is landing for you so far, a like helps this video reach people who need it. This is not a topic the algorithm tends to surface on its own. The third dimension of temporal fracture is grief that cannot complete. And I want to get into this because I think the common framing gets it wrong. It's not that people in active addiction do not feel losses, or that they do not care, or that they do not fall apart. I fell apart when Joe and Tan died, but I want to tell you about them first. Joe and I had shared a room at boarding school. In the way of boarding school intimacy, she had become family to me, the kind of family you build for yourself when the one you were born into is not functioning as a family should. She was the person I ate breakfast with and fought about hair dryers with and told things to in the dark at night. She was a sister in every way that actually counted. Tan was her half-sister, and Tan was one of the first people who took my interest in witchcraft seriously, and together we shaped it into something real and magical. I had grown up in an extremist religious cult, so my entire spiritual framework had been handed to me by an institution that was at its core about control. Leaving that framework meant dismantling my entire cosmology from the inside. It meant not knowing what was true anymore, not knowing how to relate to the sacred, not knowing who I was without the doctrine that had structured my entire childhood. I met Joe and Tan in the middle of all that, and the three of us formed a coven. Our first adventures in witchcraft and misadventures, because there were plenty of those too, became part of how I found my way back to something I could actually inhabit spiritually. The sisters were central to that process. In our early 20s, they died together in the same car accident, and I fell apart. The loss of them was an identity death in the same way that Rowan had been a self-object. Joe and Tan were that. If you want to know more about Rowan, self-objects, and identity fragmentation, I have a whole video on that. I'll put it in the description. But with Joe and Tan, there were maybe even more so of a self-object, because what was at stake was my entire emerging spiritual identity and the only family I had built for myself. So I felt it acutely. But grief requires a container. It requires somewhere to put itself, and it also requires someone to witness it and enough stability in your life so that you can stop moving long enough to actually let it move through you. and I had none of those things. I still had rent to pay, I was still in survival mode, and I had spent years constructing such a complete compartmentalization of my life that the people around me at that point did not know anything about my past and the people in it. They did not know this other self who had a different legal name and a different world, and people in it who had become everything to me. There was no one I could be fully vulnerable with, and there was no one I could tell. And I was using, which meant the grief could only begin, but it could never fully land. The substance kept it at a distance that felt at the time like the only way to stay functional. And Joe and Tan were not the only losses. My life in those years was touched by grief at every corner, at every level. A boyfriend I had loved had died. 2 other addict friends did not make it past the age of 19. My father had died. Every single one of those losses was real and immense to me. And with every single one, the same thing happened. The grief would begin, I would feel the edges of it, and then I would have to put it somewhere and keep on moving because I had no safety in which to stop, no stability in which to fall apart completely without the risk of not being able to get back up. Using kept me alive in those years, and I do not say that to romanticize it. I say it because it is true and because I think it matters to talk about these things honestly. It was a survival mechanism before it was a problem, and for a long time it was both simultaneously. Over a decade later, I was in recovery, and the grief arrived. All of it, not the softened memory of something that had happened a long time ago, but the full, unmediated weight of what it had actually meant to lose them, to lose all of them, as fresh as the week it happened, as complete as it had never been allowed to be. That is what I mean when I talk about grief that cannot be completed. It does not disappear. It does not diminish with distance. It waits inside the temporal fracture in the exact same shape it was in when it became interrupted, and it comes for you the moment there is finally enough safety for it to do so. The world finds this very difficult to understand, and when people cannot understand something, they do not always respond kindly. Sometimes they respond with dismissal or something closer to gaslighting. You might get told you are too sensitive, or you're dwelling on the past. That was a long time ago. Why are you still talking about it? Why does everything have to be such drama with you? What is delayed grief on the inside can also look like self-centeredness on the outside. It can look like an attachment to pain, a refusal to move on, a love of making things complicated. People who have not experienced temporal fracture, who have processed their losses more or less in real time, genuinely cannot understand why something from 10 years ago is landing as though it happened yesterday. And in the absence of understanding, the most convenient explanation for them is that this is a character flaw in the grieving person. What makes this worse, and this is something I rarely hear acknowledged, is that for many of us, grief arrives in a life where there is no one around who knew us then, and no one who knew who we are grieving for. That compartmentalization that kept us functioning during those years meant we built entirely new lives, new identities, and new circles of people. And the people in our present lives do not know always about the other life. They do not know Joe. They do not know Tan. They do not know what those friendships meant, or what that era cost, or why the loss of those two specific people would carry the weight that it does. There is no shared context. There is no one to witness the grief with you. You are mourning people who, to everyone around you, are simply names you've uttered. That isolation compounds everything. The delayed grief arrives when you are alone in it. And for your nervous system, remember, it did not happen long ago. It happened in a time zone you are now only gaining access to. Recovery does not let you skip the grief. It just delivers it to you in a condition of unusual freshness, and you find yourself inside a temporal fracture. I want to say something that I think is important for anyone in recovery or anyone who loves someone who's in recovery to understand. People tend to talk about recovery as though the hard part is stopping using, as though sobriety is the destination, and once you arrive, the work is done. But what recovery actually does, in my experience, especially in the early years, is remove the anesthetic and hand you approximately 10 years of undelivered emotional mail simultaneously. And that includes grief. It includes the feelings that you bypassed, relationships you never finished internally, losses you survived but never mourned, versions of yourself that were abandoned at various junctures, developmental stages that were erupted because there was no safety in which to complete them. You can run a business, you can function at an extraordinarily high level, you appear competent and intelligent, you may carry a social ease with complete conviction, while internally you're still carrying the emotional architecture of someone who is 17 years old and still trying to stay alive. Recovery does not fix this instantly, but what it does is begin to put you back in contact with actual time, so that the present becomes the present. The past starts to recede properly the way it should. Grief moves from the foreground into the background the way it is supposed to. Part of that is the specific shock of seeing people you grew up with having become fully formed adults with careers and marriages and children, the accumulated texture of a continuous life. While you were surviving, they were accumulating. And that gap is not imaginary, and it does not close overnight. It is the temporal fracture made manifest. But the journey is less like instantly getting better and more like re-entering time, like rejoining a procession you left a long time ago and having to accept that the procession moved forward without you and that your place in it is not where it was when you stepped out. It can be very disorienting, and that deserves to be acknowledged. It is the genuine, complex, and often profoundly lonely experience of temporal reintegration. If you are in recovery, or if you're living with the aftermath of addiction and you recognize what I'm describing here, I want you to hear me when I say, feeling like time froze is not a sign that there is something wrong with you. It's a sign that your nervous system was doing exactly what nervous systems do under sustained threat. It preserved things, held things in suspension, and kept you moving forward without requiring you to stop and metabolize everything that would have been unbearable to do so in the moment. The grief arrives late because you were not safe enough for it to arrive on time. The relationships remain vivid long after they should have receded because they were attached to survival and not just to memory. The interior adolescent is still present because certain developmental processes were genuinely interrupted, and that is not a flaw or a failure in you. It is what it looks like when a human being survives something that is very difficult to survive. And recovery, real recovery, is so much more than the absence of the substances. It is the slow, often painful, sometimes extraordinary process of learning to live and exist inside time again. And for anyone who is stuck in the thick of it right now, it is worth it. Every single piece of it. The delayed grief, the disorientation, the gap between where you are and where everyone else seems to be. All of it is part of something that is, in the end, a gift. I don't want to minimize what it costs, but I mean it in the way that only people who have moved through something very, very dark can fully understand. Trust the process, even when the process feels brutal, especially then. I want to speak now to those of you who are here because this is a witchcraft channel. because everything I have described so far is psychological and experiential, and I imagine some of you are sitting with the question, okay, but where does the craft come in? It comes in everywhere. The first thing witchcraft gave me during recovery was stability, because my daily practice became that container to process all this shit. It provided structure to my days that was mine, that existed regardless of what else was collapsing or resolving. Through all of that, witchcraft required me to show up in my body and in the present moment at least once a day. And for someone whose self-worth had been mostly entirely externalized, built from the outside in, from survival and facades and the validation of other people, my witchcraft practice became the first thing that said, you have inherent worth regardless of what you produce or who you are to anyone else. The altar does not care what you achieve, it only asks that you show up. That sounds simple. For someone who has been surviving on externalized worth for decades, it's not simple at all. The second thing, and this is the thing I want to say really clearly, genuine witchcraft does not bypass the darkness. It does not sand the edges of difficult experiences and say love and light and healing. It does not reframe grief as a gift until you've actually moved through the grief. It goes into the dark. The descent traditions, Inanna going into the underworld, Persephone crossing into Hades, Hecate moving at the crossroads between the living and the dead, Medusa transmuting trauma into power. These are not narratives of spiritual bypassing. They are maps for navigating what should not be avoided. The dark goddesses became my guides precisely because they do not flinch. Ereshkigal is not comforting. She strips you bare and she strikes you down, and that is the beginning of inhabiting true healing. Working with the dark divine feminine is what made the processing of the temporal fracturing possible for me, and that means processing the suspended grief, understanding the imprinting and the identity fragmentation, a cost of a life lived in Neverland. This may not have felt like a gentle process, but it was alchemical and it was honest, and it brought me into true relationship with myself. The third thing the craft gave me was something that psychology and therapy alone could never fully reach, and that is access to time itself. One of the foundational understandings in serious magical practice is that time is not linear and it is not fixed. It is layered, malleable, something that can be worked with rather than simply experienced or endured. When you internalize this as a practitioner, as a lived operational reality, it changes what becomes possible. Through timeline healing and astral work, I was able to reach back into childhood and into the earlier versions of myself that were not simply accessible to my adult present. There are parts of a person that fracture off during sustained trauma, parts that remain at the edge of the wound that cannot be retrieved through ordinary therapeutic process, because ordinary therapeutic process operates within linear time, while the craft works outside of that boundary, so it can go where linear time cannot. If you want to go deeper into identity fragmentation specifically, I have a full video on identity fragmentation and addiction that covers this in more detail, and I'll link it in the description. It is a natural companion to what we're discussing here. I have done this work with clients for years now, and what I see consistently is that the parts of the self that are the most frozen, the most temporarily displaced, are precisely the parts that respond to witchcraft approaches, because you're meeting them on their own terms. You're entering the time where they actually live. The craft also gave me tools for the issues that cause temporal fracturing, such as the imprinting I described earlier. When attachment to certain people has become unhealthy, when the energetic cord was no longer a connection but a chain. Cord cutting rituals, for example, can give you a technology for closure. It completes something that could not have been completed through conversation or just decision alone. Sure, you can decide to let go of a person, but the decision rarely does the work by itself. Ritual creates the conditions in which the letting go can actually happen in the body and the soul, and not just in the mind. And when the disorientation of re-entering time felt most acute for me, when it felt like the door was shut and the procession had moved far ahead, so far ahead that I could not find my way back into it, I worked with openers of ways, Hecate at the crossroads, the principle that closed doors are not permanent. Neverland is not the final destination, and being lost is not the same as being without a path entirely. Witchcraft gives you the understanding that someone has stood at every threshold you are standing at, and you can call on that presence, the knowledge and the wisdom and the resources of lineage and spirit. None of this replaced the step work or the years of ordinary hard recovery work, but it ran alongside all of that, and it reached into places those things could not reach alone. It held the parts of the process that required so much more than cognition, therapy, talking, and journaling. This is what I mean when I say witchcraft is not just aesthetics or identity or community, though it can be all of those things. At its core, it is a set of technologies for working with reality, time, energy, the self, the dead, the unresolved. All of this is workable. All of it can be moved. If this resonated, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments, where did time freeze for you? Tell me which part landed, or tell me your own version of this. This is one of those conversations that needs more than one voice in it, and the comment section on a video like this tends to become something worth reading. If you are in recovery, or if you love someone who is, and something here gave you words to an experience you did not previously have language for, share it with whoever needs it. The identity fragmentation video is below. If temporal fracture as a topic resonated, that video goes deeper into the psychological mechanisms underneath it. If you're new here and this is your first video on the channel, this is what I do: witchcraft, dark goddess work, the psychology of trauma and recovery, and the places where all of those things meet. Subscribe if you want to stay, hit the notification bell to know when I post. I'll see you in the next video. Much love and blessed.